So, I mean, that's an amazing solo, right? That's Prince, an incredible musician. But the reality is whether you're playing at an amazing gig like that, or if you're just playing at a backyard barbecue, it never really changes. That moment before you launch into your solo, it's kind of make or break, right? And you get that rush of adrenaline. So the question is, how do you jump off that cliff and land on your feet just like Prince did? What's going on there, right? Well, obviously there's intangible things, right? It's hard to define exactly the transfer of emotion onto a guitar, but there are some things that you can learn, right? So there's basically 3 ingredients that you can think about when it comes to playing a melody, which is essentially note choice, phrasing, and then the way you actually play, which I'm going to call articulation. How do you actually articulate the note? So, like, for example, take a listen to the beginning of Red House. It's kind of a similar thing. It's just like that expression and that emotion is just amazing. So let's dive right in. What we're going to start looking at is the kind of the emotional weight of each note in the scale. And, you know, great music it's kind of like telling a story, right? There's conflict, there's resolution. You're taking your listeners on a journey when you play a solo. So one of the fundamental concepts in music is tension and resolution. The most kind of basic form of music really is based around pentatonic scales, because pentatonic scales are they're almost like naturally occurring scales. They're almost like hardwired into us. Like when you just kind of start to sing, or a lot of folk music is kind of based around major and minor pentatonic scales because they're just primitive sounding scales. So you got basically you got the basic minor pentatonic scale. And then major scales and keys and all that kind of stuff is much more of a modern invention. So immediately when you're playing the pentatonic scale, you're kind of tapping into something very primal. A lot of guitar soloing has its kind of foundation in the blues, right? And the blues leads to rock and roll, and then rock and roll leads to rock music, and on and on and on. So a lot of the foundation of modern music comes from that place. And there's a certain tonality to the blues. So if we really understand that, it's going to massively help your guitar playing. Now, a lot of people think the blues is very simple. They just think it's 3 chords. That's true, actually. You know, the blues is simple in a lot of ways. But that's just kind of one level. That's one way of looking at it. But if you go beneath that, it's actually one of the most complex and nuanced forms of music. You know, there's no other style of music where you can bend and tweak the notes and just kind of like... You know, so colorful. And, you know, within blues, you can really manipulate and play these kind of almost like microtonal notes. And in many other kinds of music, that would kind of sound wrong. I mean, our ears are very used to that now, which is cool, but it all comes from the blues. It's also a form of music that's built on creativity. It's built on improvisation. But what's interesting about it is blues is creativity with constraints. So that's one of the rules of creativity, is like if you just have like no constraints to your creativity, you actually will find that you get overwhelmed really easily. But when you create this kind of walled garden, which is what the blues is, where you've got these 12 bars, right? If you look on the screen there, it shows you the basic progression, that familiar progression, you know, like that. So those kind of constraints of those 12 bars and those 3 chords give you the ability to be incredibly creative. One of the other things about the blues, right, is as you dig into it, you'll see it's not really just 3 chords. Blues is actually 3 different movements through 3 different keys. So it's actually a modulation of 3 different key centers. So every time you change chord, you're actually changing key. So when you're playing a blues in A, you start off and you're really actually playing over an A7 chord. So an A7 chord is actually the 5 chord of the key of D major. When you're playing a blues in A, you start off and you're actually playing, in a sense, in the key of D major, but with the tonal center being around the A chord. And that gives you the unique sound of blues. When you change to the 4 chord, to the D, you're actually playing over a D7. And a D7 is the 5 chord of the key of G. And then when you go to the E7, that's actually the 5 chord of the key of A major. So you're playing in 3 different keys as you're playing the blues. And that's what really great blues players do, is they're actually, when they're soloing, they're not just jamming up and down the pentatonic scale, they're actually kind of moving through those chord changes. And even beyond that, there's actually movement within each chord in the blues. The blues is full of all these kind of riffs. You know, or even just going back and forth. Like A to A6, that's actually 2 different chords. You know, so there's actually a lot going on with the actual harmony behind blues. Or you could... So let's start by just looking at the basic pentatonic scale, and what I want to do is show you kind of the emotional weight of each note. And the idea here is, when you're playing your riffs and soloing and stuff like that, you might use licks like, you know, for example, classic blues licks like, or something like that, right? Now, those are cool licks and they work all over the blues, right? But if you want to sound really good, it's got a lot to do with the note you start on and the note that you end on. So if you understand what is the emotional weight of each note, then you can really make your licks sound a lot better by figuring out how to begin them and end them, and what notes you kind of want to emphasize. All right, so the blues scale, it contains these notes A, C, D, and then if it's the blues scale, you've got the chromatic D sharp in there as well. And then you've got E and then G. So those are the 6 notes. And then it just repeats. Now, if you're playing over the 1 chord, obviously the root note is going to sound very stable. But the minor third has a very kind of heavy sound. It's got this soulful, melancholic sound. And then the 4th, over the 1 chord, it's got a little bit of tension on it, right? If you're playing this note, the perfect 4th, this note here. So when you play that over the 1 chord, it gives you that sound, right? So there's a bit of tension there. And then the next note is very tense. It's the diminished 5th. It's got this edgy, dissonant sound, but it's also a beautiful sound for blues because it's got that, it's the blue note, right? It's got that dissonance that you use so much in blues. And then you've got the 5th, which is really strong and solid. That's a really powerful note. And then you've got the minor 7th, G, which is, again, that note, the minor 7th, it's got a little bit of tension on it, right? But it's within the chord of an A7 chord. It's right there. And that note is at the essence of rock music, is that flat 7 or that minor 7th. Because really rock and blues music, a big part of it is this idea of playing major chords and then having a flat 7th in it. So it's like a major chord with a minor 7th in it, right? So it creates this built-in tension, and the blues really, really takes that tension and manipulates it. Okay, so check this out. So if you take a blues like that, right, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to loop the first bar, which is the 1 chord, the A chord, and then I'm going to play each of the notes over the top of that. And you're going to see the weight of each note. Okay, so here's the root note. Okay, so you might might think that's redundant just to play the root, but it's actually a really powerful note. And you can manipulate that note. Like, check this out. Here's Billy Gibbons talking about the root note. This is really cool here.
One of the favorite cornerstone licks, B.B. King, the slide up from the 1 to the 1. All-time favorite.
All right, so basically, you're jumping from the 1 to the 1, right? So you jump strings there. So obviously the 1 is very stable, but it's like home. As you can hear him play there, he actually goes up to the minor third there. So let's listen to what the minor third sounds like. Because here's the minor third. It's got a heavy sound, right? All right, so that minor third, right? It's got this kind of heavy sound, but a lot of times in blues, that minor third, I call it a flexible third, where you'll actually pull a little bit. You'll squeeze that minor third towards the major third, and what it does is it sweetens it up. And it's like almost like when you're playing over the 1 chord, you're almost always gonna want to kind of just squeeze that minor third. And it sweetens it, and it reflects the actual major third in the chord. All right, so next we've got the 4th. So you can hear there's a lot of tension there actually on the 4th. The 4th always wants to resolve generally to the 3rd. It's called a suspension, or to the 5th. But the 4th, in music they call it a suspended 4th, because it has that unresolved sound. Okay, and then we've got the 5th. So that's a kingly sounding note. The 5th is other than the root, it's the most powerful consonant sounding note. It's the note of a power chord, right? So whenever you start your solos, in fact, when Prince is playing, he starts on the 5th, where he's bending up to an E note. So it's this really powerful, immensely stable sounding note. But then he creates that tension with that crying sound he's going from the 5th, and then he pulls it down. Creates that crying sound by going from that powerful, big, grand 5th to that flat 5, or which is the diminished note. And that note has a lot of tension on it. It's the blue note, right? So he's like playing this kind of like crying sound by going from the 5th to that diminished to that flat 5 note. Then he'll pull that all the way down from the 5th to the 4th. So he goes from the 5th down to the flat 5, and then down from the 5th to the 4th. Like that. So he's kind of walking from the totally consonant to a very dissonant, a lot of tension, and then kind of semi-resolving it to the 4th, and then pulling it back down to the root. Back down to the A there. Okay, and then the last one is the flat 7. See, that note it's got tension on it, right? But it also just sounds killer. It almost sounds like it doesn't have tension on it because our ears are so used to hearing it. You know, it's just that note is in every riff ever written, probably. So you can see each note has a different weight on it, right? And obviously those notes are going to change when you play over the different chords. Like when you go to the D to the 4 chord, the weight of those notes are going to change. And then when you go to the 5 chord, like what's interesting is if you go to the 4 chord, right? Check this out. So I'm on bar 6, right? I'm just going to loop it on the 4 chord. Listen to the weight of each note over the 4 chord. Alright, so what do you notice? There's no tension there. Over the 4 chord, when you're playing a D7 chord, all the notes in the minor pentatonic scale just fit perfectly over it. Even that minor third. But then check out this. I'm going to loop the E chord. Listen to how the minor pentatonic scale sounds over this chord. What do you notice there? It's all tension. All the notes, except for the E, create a lot of tension. So basically, when you're playing a minor pentatonic scale over that 5 chord in a blues, it's got a lot of tension on it. It sounds really outside. So basically, the way you'd work this out, a lot of it is how do you want to begin and end your phrasing. So for example, when you're playing over the 1 chord, if you end on that minor third there, it just kind of, it sounds okay. It's got a lot of tension on it, but it sounds a bit sour. Whereas if you do this, bend it up, or even hammer, it sounds killer. Whereas if you go to the 4 chord, if you go to the 4 chord, you'll see there's no tension when you land on that note. So you can land on that note freely and it sounds really good. So let me give you some examples of that. 4 chord, 5 chord, 1 chord, 5 chord,